there, Rednecks, Preppies, Redneck Preppies. It's me, the Redneck Preppy. How you doing today? Great? Good. Not surprisingly, some of you had stuff to say about the 5 military rifle myths video. One myth in particular. Most of the myths I spotlighted are fading, but one of them, the case of the .30 carbine during the Korean War, continues to thrive. So I'm going to answer some of the points raised by viewers, and I'm also going to touch upon some of the other theories that have been posited to support the claim that .30 carbine rounds were stopped by the heavy frozen winter gear worn by the North Koreans and Chinese during the winter periods of the Korean War. Let's get into it. We have quite a bit of ground to cover. This is the one that I touched upon as a plausible explanation for the apparent immortality of enemy soldiers during the Korean War. Basically, I argued that the quality of shooting by American soldiers armed with the M1 Carbine or otherwise probably wasn't up to snuff. Now, I didn't go too deep into this in the original video because I didn't want each segment to last forever, but I've read plenty of good arguments that the soldiers sent to the Korean Peninsula after the North invaded weren't perhaps the top-of-the-line troops. Now, as I stated in the video, many of the soldiers sent in initially to check the North's soldiers had been stationed in Japan as post-war occupation forces. Now, by the time the Korean War began in June 1950, the Second World War had been over for 5 years. That meant that the large majority of soldiers had been inducted and trained into the U.S. Army after the war was over. I don't think it's a huge secret that training standards weren't quite what they were during the war for a number of reasons. Now, I'm not saying that all of the American soldiers sent to Korea initially were greenhorns who didn't know their ass from their elbows. There were military lifers and World War II veterans among them. But I would argue that the majority of those soldiers, the new guys, had never fired a weapon in war. You send a bunch of guys used to chasing Japanese skirts into a war, and suddenly you have men who are facing large-scale attacks and being shot at for the first time. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that men unused to that situations would line up shots, miss, but be sure that they hit the target. Suddenly it isn't their poor shooting, it's this, ad hoc body armor that the North Koreans and later Chinese were wearing in the form of frozen winter gear. Also, as an aside, I think most people don't realize how much the .30 carbine round drops off at 200 yards, leading people to think that they're shooting accurately, but hitting the ground instead. That's something that you find out in training and with experience. Do I think that the poor shooter explanation is plausible? I think so. Okay, so next up we have another theory that the enemy soldiers were hopped up on goofballs and it would take several shots from an M1 Carbine to take them down because they were so high they didn't even know they were being hit by the massive .30 carbine round. It's certainly not the first time that we've heard American soldiers noting that they were facing drugged-up enemies with a round that some considered anemic. The U.S. military was blessed, after all, by the M1911 pistol after they fought guerrillas during the Moro Rebellion. The Americans were using the Colt M1892 revolver chambered in .38 long Colt, and they complained that the lack of stopping power, high moral morale, and, drugs, meant that the tribesmen were eating bullets and still coming. So were the North Koreans and Chinese on drugs which limited their ability to feel pain or gunshots from the M1 carbine? To be honest, I've actually found more proof that the Americans were on drugs during the war than the enemy's soldiers. It's not a secret that the American military handed out amphetamines during the Second World War and dextroamphetamines in Vietnam. I don't think it takes a huge leap of faith to argue that a lot of American soldiers were on speed in Korea. But the enemy? I'm not saying that they weren't high on their own supply. Chances are they were on something, since many armies beginning in World War II did dope up the troops. And how American soldiers during the Battle of Fallujah reported that insurgents were Cheech and Chong levels high on cocaine and amphetamines to the point that they kept fighting even when severely injured. I think it's certainly possible and plausible that enemy soldiers used drugs. I just haven't been able to confirm it or which ones they would have used. Probably amphetamines. If they were, it would certainly explain why some of them could eat gunshots and apparently still keep coming. Okay, so one comment left on the video stated that the truth, and I'm going to put that one in air quotes, was that the .30 carbine ammo issued to the American soldiers was of poor quality, and the cold Korean winter further degraded that powder. I believe it was WC-820, which then reduced bullet velocity to about 600 feet per second. He stated also that in addition to slowing the round down, that it also caused barrel fouling and jamming. Now, I'm going to attest right away that there are several environmental factors which can affect the velocity of a bullet. It's well known that humidity that's present when the ammunition is manufactured has been shown to cause changes in velocity. Reloaders also know that there are such things as temperature-sensitive powders whose performance can be affected by ambient air temperature. We're talking, however, of changes of a few percent. The problem with accepting the comment's claim that velocity was reduced to 600 feet per second is that the military round standard traveled at about 2,000 feet per second. Assuming that the powder was normal, there's no way that even the coldest temperatures would reduce that velocity to far less than half of normal velocity. But the comment stated that the powder was bad, which wouldn't be the first time that was true in American military history. The problem is I can't find any primary reports stating such, nor have I seen any after-the-fact reports. Here's why I have some doubts about penetration being affected by bad powder. The ammunition used in Korea could have well been manufactured during the Second World War. No secret that the U.S. went on a manufacturing spree in late 1944 and early 1945, stockpiling equipment for the planned invasion of Japan. So much stuff, by the way, that Purple Hearts that are being handed out today were manufactured in 1944 or 1945. At any rate, there were no faulty reports of ammo in the Second World War in the European theater, where M1 carbines were used during winter battles no less cold than Korea. No reports either of invulnerable German troops, for that matter. Could the ammunition have been made after World War II and be defective? Of course, but we have no way of knowing what ammunition was used by soldiers claiming ineffective .30 carbine rounds. Now, despite my doubt about this, there are people who argue that in Korea alone, and particularly at the Battle of Choson Reservoir, that soldiers complained about short-range hits that didn't appear to wound the enemy. Not in World War II or Vietnam, just Korea. Those same people argue that there may have been a change to the gunpowder that reduced bullet velocity and increased malfunctions. Americans certainly did see more malfunctions for the M1 carbine in Korea than the other wars. Those same people, though, they don't bring that solid proof to the table. Now, there have also been some people that state that it wasn't the powder, but rather a humidity stabilizing component in the gunpowder that caused the issue. They say that the component was designed for the tropics of the Pacific, and it was adversely reacted by the cold and caused reduced velocities. Again, it's a theory, but we don't have any evidence to support it. All that said, the best we can do today is mimic the .30 carbine round for testing, which really wouldn't do much to prove or disprove the contention of bad powder. Moreover, even if we tested .30 carbine from the era, and you can buy it, I'm not sure testing 7-year-old ammunition is going to prove much either. The only way we can find out for sure is traveling back in time, and this channel's budget isn't big enough to do that. So another theory that I've heard is that the M1 carbine actually wasn't the issue. It was the M2 carbine. If you're not up on your milsurp rifles, the M2 carbine is the select fire version of the M1 carbine. The argument goes like this. During battle, soldiers would invariably flip the switch on the M2 and go full rock and roll. If one bullet is awesome, many bullets is awesomer. The M2 is obviously generally lighter than most submachine guns used by the American military, and when combined with fully automatic fire, could render it difficult to control during long bursts. Combine that with relatively poor training that I mentioned earlier in the video, plus inexperience. If you haven't gone full auto, I can tell you that it takes training and practice to use it effectively, and you essentially have guys spraying bullets everywhere. I can certainly buy that. You might get one bullet on target in a burst, but the ones afterwards, if you don't know what you're doing, will be aimed at God above. Is it plausible? Could be. There have also been arguments of weak mainsprings, lubricant that went thick in the cold, garbage magazines. I mean, that last one is certainly true. But those don't cause bullets to bounce off North Koreans and Chinese. So we'll ignore them. Okay, so I left this one deliberately for the end because I find it the most interesting. Now, if you aren't familiar with this one, it basically goes that the heavy winter clothing that the North Koreans and the Chinese were wearing basically turned into body armor after it froze in the winter. Even at intermediate ranges, let's say past 50 yards, there was an excellent chance that the .30 carbine round would bounce off, or more likely, fail to penetrate the fully frozen and thick clothing. Now, this one is ostensibly tough because you could argue that a confluence of factors came together. Ammunition that performed poorly in the winter, combined with the winter gear of the enemy, caused ostensibly accurate shots to be ineffective. Good story. Too bad it's nonsense. I've seen so many tests of this theory that I'm confident in saying that .30 carbine at ranges up to 200 yards have no difficulty penetrating clothing even heavier than what the North Koreans and Chinese were wearing, and creating a bad day for the person behind it. Now, granted, all of these tests were predicated on the ammunition functioning normally. But don't listen to me. How about someone who actually fought in the Korean War? As Jack Valentine of the 25th Division in Korea stated, you hear stories about the Chinese being shot with carbines in all of their winter clothing and they just brushed it off. I have shot Chinese in all of their winter gear with an M2 carbine, and those rounds have gone completely through them, in front and out the back. I know because I had to search them for maps and documents. Now, other soldiers also know that the .30 carbine had no problems killing enemy soldiers at the range the rifle was designed for, and that the cold affected it no worse than it did the M1 Garand. That said, this is a myth that I've wanted to test for a long time, and since I live in Northern Ontario, with some occasionally brutal spells of cold temperatures, I think I could test this theory in pretty realistic conditions, so perhaps that's going to be a video in the next few months. Until then, however, I'm comfortable in saying the following. 1. The M1 Carbine was designed to be a replacement for the M1911 pistol for certain personnel. As such, it was designed to be combat effective out to about 200 yards at most. Many of the reported events took place at distances greater than that. Now, granted, there are stories of guys shooting at soldiers as close to 50 yards ineffectively, but I think distance is actually a pretty good explanation for some of this. How effective at penetration is the .30 carbine round, let's say 250 to 300 yards away? 2. It's difficult to believe that any soldier could operate effectively with several inches of frozen clothing. Never mind the fact that simply moving would be a nightmare, let alone running at American positions as part of a human wave. Any soldier would probably die pretty quickly due to hypothermia. 3. Frozen clothes are not body armor. The ballistics of the .30 carbine round is more than enough to pass through many layers of frozen clothes easily. So no, I don't find the frozen clothing theory to be possible or plausible. Alright, so this video accomplished nothing outside of eating up several hours of my life making it and minutes of your life enduring it. Great use of all of our time, right? At any rate, I hope you found this video to be mildly entertaining and vaguely informative. As always, may all of your shots ring true, particularly if you happen to be behind an M1 carbine and you got a mass of North Koreans or Chinese invading South Korea in front of you. Take care, and bye-bye.